I had a sister born on my ninth birthday,
Really? So you guys share a birthday, huh? That's pretty neat.
and a brother born the day before, about 2 years later.
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, it's 6:30. We are here in our dining room at St. Anne, and today, of course, since it's the first Tuesday of the month, we celebrate um, Friends Who in Faith. So today, because August, which is interesting, has the most days, we actually have an optional memorial almost every day. So what that means is that we basically can celebrate a saint every day this month, except for maybe like one or two, but it has the most consecutive days where we can actually do that compared to any other month. So I thought it might be a good opportunity to actually talk about sainthood, what it means to be a saint, why do we have them, uh, what's the process of becoming one, what is one in general. So I thought this might be a pretty good discussion. And so maybe it's important first off to talk about what a saint is. So we define a saint as anyone, any person, meaning any rational soul that's with God in heaven. So that includes angels, that includes humans, that includes anything that's basically hierarchical above the rationale for humans, right? So we are the lowest in the spiritual realm, but we're the highest in the natural. So what that would mean is a human, an angel, anyone that's actually with God in heaven. Now, what's interesting about this is that we have a feast day on the calendar because one may say, "Well, Father, why don't you talk about this in November?" Because November we have a feast day, even though this year it's not a holy day of obligation because it falls on a Saturday. So we don't necessarily, I think, or Sunday. Either way, we don't actually have the obligation this year to go to mass that day. Um, but on November 1st, we celebrate All Saints. Now, some would say, well, yeah, that includes all the canonized saints. And the answer to that is no. All Saints Day is not necessarily for the canonized saints because the canonized saints already have days, right? They have days on the calendar that we celebrate. All Saints Day is for those that we don't know if they're saints or not, but are. So that can include members of our family, our parents, our grandparents, our siblings, our great grandparents, our descendants. Because even though we have literally tens of thousands canonized saints, we probably hopefully have billions of actual saints, meaning there are people in our family that we hope today are with God in heaven. And then All Saints Day then was directed towards them, not towards the people like St. Augustine, or like today we celebrate St. John Vianney, or St. Monica, or any of these other saints that are wonderful examples of the faith for us. Because there may be other saints that aren't canonized that also are wonderful examples of the faith for us. So that's what the purpose of the saints are. They are this communion that's with God for all eternity, that we can ask for their prayers directly to God. And not only that, but also their lives are great examples of hope for us who remain, that we can maybe follow suit, which is why we have patron saints, right? So there's patrons for literally every profession, every state of life. I think it was rather interesting. I mentioned this morning in one of my homilies, I had two masses today, but you know, um, it took 1,800 years for parish priests to have a patron saint. That's rather interesting, considering the priesthood has been around since even before Jesus, back to Melchizedek. But the day we celebrate St. John Vianney, who wasn't made a patron saint of the priesthood until the 19th century. So it's like, well, who was before that? Well, yeah, there wasn't one. Um, I got to research this. I haven't looked too far in this, but it's interesting that we have a patron saint for deacons, who's actually St. Lawrence. We celebrate actually on the 10th of this month. We have a patron saint for parish priests. We have patron saints for all the different orders and their priesthoods. We don't have necessarily a patron saint for bishops. Now, one may argue, well, that could be St. Peter. Sure, okay, fine. But declaratively, I don't know if there actually is one, which is rather interesting. I may be wrong on that. So if I'm wrong, I'll correct that. Um, but literally every other profession, there is actually a saint that's associated with that. For instance, clowns. Actually, the same patron saint for deacons is the patron saint of clowns, St. Lawrence, because of his sense of humor. As the story goes, the Pope was martyred with 3 other deacons, but the governor of the area left one deacon to gather up all the goods, all of the riches of the church to bring to him in a particular church there in Rome. And so St. Lawrence said, well, give me 3 days to gather all this stuff because there's a lot, right? So 3 days later, the governor comes to the church, and there, behold, St. Lawrence has gathered the lame, the elderly, those that are dying. And so, of course, because of that, the governor was so upset that he put St. Lawrence to death by putting him on a spit and roasting him. To which it was said, and this may be more legend than fact, we don't really know for sure, turn me over, I'm done on this side, right? Which is why he is the patron saint of clowns, comedians, anything to deal with humor. So yeah, we have all these different saints. Like even before I became a priest, I was an engineer. And so the patron saint of engineers, actually there's several. There's St. Albert the Great. There's also St. Patrick. Now what's interesting is that sometimes these saints don't necessarily have a connection with the things they're maybe patrons of. There may be a very, very loose connection. One could say maybe St. Patrick engineered a way out of slavery in a way. I mean, maybe that's what happened. I don't know. But there's also, like, for instance, the patron saint of the internet.
Makes total sense there.
Well, St. Patrick is not. What I'm saying is the patron saint of the internet actually is St. Isidore, the farmer. Well, Carlo Acutis is actually the patron saint of video games and maybe like computer web pages and stuff like that.
What is the thing they call where everybody talks to each other now? It's
we talking about like texting or like social media?
Social media.
Yeah, probably you could say social media. Because he was like born around the time that was actually coming into, or actually died around the time this was actually coming into existence. But Isidore is the patron saint of the internet, but he was a farmer. I mean, he also lived, 500 years before the internet ever came about. So what's going on there? I don't know.
But
right?
St. Joseph's the patron saint of labor. That makes sense.
He is. Right? He is, yes, because he was a worker. He's also St. Joseph actually has a lot of patronages, fathers, families, the church, protection of the church. So he has a lot of titles too that are associated with him. So the point of the matter is, though, we have these saints that we can look to as not only people can ask for intercession for in our particular walk of life, but also give us good examples of how to live our own life that could also lead to the same end, which is hopefully sainthood. The communion saints is often looked at as sort of like it's kind of like communication aspect. So sometimes a good analogy might be like, if I asked someone living here on earth to pray for me, of course, we're both praying that there's usually a good indication that whatever we're asking for, as long as it's good, will be answered by God in a favorable way. Maybe a good analogy that would be, let's say I'm in a job and maybe I'm really new in the job and maybe I haven't had that much experience in the job, but a friend of mine on the job has really good relationship with my boss. And so there's something coming up, a wedding coming up for a good friend. And, I can ask the boss for time off, but it might be good for me to go through my friend because of the relationship they have, right? The boss might be prone to kind of like grant me my request because of the friendship they have with my friend, rather than me going directly to that boss. I can still go to the boss. I can still go to Jesus. I can still ask for the intercession directly, of course, and ask others to pray for me too. But it's probably more prone to happen if I actually get more people involved, especially those that are close to my boss, to ask for that same thing. And that's sort of akin, again, every analogy falls short in some ways, but that's sort of akin to the communion of saints, that we have these people that are there, that are beloved, that are with God for eternity, and offering this intercession to him constantly. And so it might behoove me to ask for that intercession from my friend, and maybe after that, go directly to the boss and ask for those things, right? But ultimately, it's just another way for people to pray for each other. That's really what the communion of saints does for us. They intercede for us. And so it's asking like a good friend to intercede on my behalf. So Saints then are those that are not necessarily canonized by the church. They could be, anyone's with God in heaven, which means not necessarily Catholic. So one may say, well, can there be non-Catholic saints that are canonized? Well, actually, we have examples of that. For instance, just a few years ago in Syria, there were 10 Orthodox Christians that were beheaded for their faith. One of those members, though, was not Christian. One of the 10. So there are 9 Orthodox Christians. One of the 10 was with them and witnessed their execution and how they would not deny their faith. And he had the option of just walking away or becoming Muslim or whatever it was. But instead, he said, well, if these men who've exhibited this faith so well have that much confidence they're going to be living this eternal reward, I want to follow them. And so these 10 have been canonized by the church as martyrs for the faith. As a matter of fact, just last couple months ago, we celebrated St. Charles Lwanga. St. Charles Lwanga was an African priest from Uganda. He was a man in the court of the king in Uganda, and he was being pressured to engage in homosexual acts because the king, I guess, thought there was some good in that. And so he denied it, of course, and brought others with him who were both Catholic and Anglican, and they were martyred for the faith. And so even those Anglican martyrs have been recognized as martyrs for the faith. So we have these particular saints that aren't necessarily Catholic, but also the church would also recognize that it's best if these saints that are canonized are Catholic. And part of that goes through the process of canonization. Because again, if we're models of the faith and we understand the Catholic Church has the fullness of the faith, it would make sense these models for us would also have the fullness of the faith, meaning they would be Catholic as well. And there's somewhat of an aspect, and this is not definitively taught by the church, but this is Father Madden, maybe professing this for the rationality. I would tend to say that anyone in heaven is Catholic. That is a huge claim. And again, that's probably why the church doesn't necessarily definitively teach this. But I would say that once someone is in heaven, they already received the fullness of faith, would automatically make them Catholic. Because that's what Jesus established here on earth that would still exist even in heaven.
So you're saying that based on whether they know it or believe it or not, if they're because that's what we believe. When you're there, you've fulfilled everything. And
I think all of us, the moment of our death, are going to have everything revealed to us, all the mysteries of the faith in every way, and so we still have the opportunity to say yes to that. And so, in that regard, all the grace of the sacraments we give that person, and they would be part of the church, the Catholic Church primarily. And we understand that the church is manifest in 3 ways, right? So we have the church militant here on earth. We're still fighting the fight. We're in the army. We're fighting the devil, right? We have the church suffering, which is those in purgatory who are on their way to heaven. And of course, those in heaven called the church triumphant, right? So if you're Catholic, you're part of that church. And so that's why I would posit, just in rationality, you're given the fullness of the faith at the moment of your death to choose. And if you choose it, that would make you Catholic. So again, that can be controversial, but I think that makes sense. So one can maybe argue something different. So in that regard, it would make sense that a canonized saint would also be Catholic too, because they have the fullness of faith exhibited here on earth. So how does one then become a saint, whether canonized or not? Well, the main sticking point, the essence of a saint, is heroic virtue. Now, it doesn't require heroic virtue to be canonized. To be a saint. It requires heroic virtue to be canonized. But just exhibiting moral virtue would be enough to get you to purgatory, which would then get you to heaven, right? So following all the commandments, following the teaching of Jesus, living a moral life in accord with God's will would qualify you to become a saint. But it's those that exhibit the heroic virtue that go beyond the moral that would actually be the stuff of those canonized saints. So let's say, for instance, God forbid, but let's say someone comes into this room with a automated weapon or a semi-automatic weapon, or even not automatic, just full trigger shoot gun, and threatens us here in this room. It would not be immoral for all of us to take cover and try to find shelter and protect our lives. that would be morally virtuous, right? Protecting of life is a good thing, right? There's prudence involved with that. A heroic virtue would be for someone to jump in front of the gunman or take the gunman out, or even in the process get killed for the sake of other people to like be able to be saved. Maybe heroic fortitude, heroic even faith in that matter, knowing that, hey, this is what I'm destined to do, and God's calling me to this, and I know that I'm going to be with him today in heaven. Those are heroic virtues. Doesn't necessarily have to be courage. There could be heroic virtues of charity. We look at Mother Teresa, went out of her way to provide charity to those that were dying, those the poorest of the poor. There could be heroic hope, right? This kind of, demanding perseverance in the face of any kind of, confrontation or roadblock, right? It could be, even an aspect of heroic prudence, right? Counseling people to avoid certain aspects of their life to get away from evil, right? Some of the saints, even things like, I can think like Francis of Sales and others who were wonderful examples of prudence for the people they serve. So it doesn't necessarily have to be like courage. We think of courage as kind of the primary thing because, especially the martyrs, they exhibited great courage in kind of, laying down their life for Jesus. But any virtue can be heroic. And so that would be kind of the first part, that if, let's say, my grandmother passes away, and they both have passed away. Let's say, though, I on reflection, think about my grandmother's life and say, man, grandma was a wonderful woman. She always was there for us when we needed her. She provided, funds to put us through school. She always had cookies ready for us, right? She was always very thoughtful and always outward focused, not centered herself, especially towards her family, her grandchildren, her children. I'm gonna write to the Archbishop of St. Louis and ask them to open up a cause for my grandmother. And a cause is just kind of an investigation. And part of this is sort of like a trial. Like you lay out, well, here's why grandma was a good woman, why she deserves to be a saint, and here's how she exhibited heroic virtue. And there's others that would look into this and maybe interview people within the diocese and say archdiocese and talk to grandmother's friends and her family and even kind of look at like maybe some bad aspects of bad habits of my grandma. Let's say like she liked to drink a little bit, or maybe she liked to go to the boats, right? Gamble, whatever it is. Well, that could be brought up and say, okay, well, we have to weigh these things against each other and see, what the Lord is leading us to. Ultimately, the Archbishop has the final say. And after reviewing all the evidence, all of the information, he will make a statement. And if he agrees that grandmother has exhibited heroic virtue, he would then elevate her to servant of God. And at that point, the Archdiocese said, yeah, we believe this person is a saint, right? They've exhibited this heroic virtue, which would be good models for the people of the Archdiocese and people in general. And therefore, we believe that she's with God in heaven. What would then happen is it would be sent to, all the package would be sent to Rome. And Rome would have to investigate everything and determine the same thing. And maybe go even deeper in their investigation as far as who grandma was. Were these people reliable? Were there other aspects of her life that weren't necessarily investigated? And kind of verify everything the Archdiocese did, but even go beyond that. And if they do investigation, and then this is now the Holy Father, or his designate, would then, if they were to decide that, yes, we agree with that diocese or archdiocese that grandma exhibited heroic virtue, she then would become venerable. So at that point, venerable just means that, worthy of veneration, meaning we can maybe honor grandma with, let's say, particular prayers, maybe particular litanies, devotions, right? Maybe grandma had a particular, bracelet or something she really loved and had it blessed, and she would always rely on that, that blessing to kind of get her through life. Well, maybe we can also have other bracelets that are, copies of that to give out to people that are blessed and that kind of thing too. At this point, also, there might be a harvesting of relics, meaning maybe grandmother's exhumed, and we take pieces of her bone or hair or whatever else, right?
That stuff.
Because we are an incarnational people. We believe that the body is also sacred, and so those who are with heaven, their bodies will be resurrected as well, and their bodies then are sacred too. We have a connection with them, right? We're tangible. We're tangible people. We all are. Even human beings, we need senses, right? We experience through our senses. We know through our senses. And the relics are examples of that connection with those that are with God in heaven. Okay, so wonderful. We're starting to do that process. Maybe also, too, when we exhume grandma, we find out she's incorrupt. It's been maybe dozens of years since she passed away. I mean, that's also why this takes a long time usually, is because there's a lot of investigation goes into it. The church wants to be sure when they declare somebody these ways that they are. And it has happened in the past where bodies have been exhumed of saints, and the body was as if it were newly buried.
So has there been any saints that the body looks normal, like it has been corrupt?
Oh, it has deteriorated?
Deteriorated.
Oh, sure, of course,
Okay,
many.
so that's not a telltale sign.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean,
There
there
I
are
know what
many.
you're talking about.
There are many more corrupted bodies than incorrupted bodies,
Okay.
right?
Okay.
So maybe a good example of that, Teresa Lisieux, for instance, and even going even further back from that, Saint Bernardine of Subaru. So these saints are now about almost 200 years old, but their body is still incorrupt, which is rather interesting. So that's actually then maybe contribute to be a miracle, which is kind of the next step, right? So if veneration's done towards these particular saints, maybe we're asking for grandma's intercession, even things that can't be explained by science, and they're granted. Rome then comes in again and starts doing investigations and studies and testing to ensure there is no other explanation for these things to happen. If they do, they would attribute that particular person with that miracle. And here's where the tricky part is. In order to actually attribute that miracle to that particular person, that's the only person that actually has intercession for. So if I'd say my mom is suffering from, I don't know, let's see, what's a horrible, maybe like a severe case of heart failure. And she's going through aspects of heart failure that are not only painful, but also they're leading to her death. If I just say, okay, grandma and St. Anthony and, St. Cecilia and, St. Patrick and all these other people, if I'm just asking intercession for all these saints and the miracle happens, oh, look, we got a miracle. Okay, we can verify the miracle and say, yeah, there's no other explanation for this. It's amazing. She was in heart failure and now her heart is as strong as she was a 18-year-old woman. We can't explain that. There was no particular drug. There was no particular treatment given her that we can actually say this should happen.
Divine intervention.
In other words, it has to be something supernatural that can't be explained. Okay, wow, that's amazing. Yeah, this is truly a miracle. We can actually even say it is. Hey, who did you ask intercession for when you were asked for this miracle? Well, I did ask my grandma, but I also asked the other saints. Oh, okay.
The Gatling guy.
Right. Okay. Well, that's a problem at least for your canonization of your grandma, because we can't attribute this to her.
Had you only prayed to your grandma?
If I only prayed to ask my grandma for that intercession, they'd come back and say, yep, you know what? Okay, good. We've verified this. We've shown the intercession has only been towards this person. Holy Father, here's all the information. He reviews it or is designated, and they say, okay, you know what? We agree. This is a legitimate miracle that you can believe in. That's another aspect of this too. When it comes to these things like miracles, even particular saints, all the church says is you can. It doesn't say you have to. Holy Mother Church does not pressure us or push us to actually believe these things. All Holy Mother Church asks is that, or actually says is, yeah, you can. You can have good reason to, but you don't have to, which is rather amazing, because there's a lot of things that can't be explained that's happened over time, even back in the Old Testament, even dating back to things like the flood and the crossing of the Red Sea, where there's actually scientific evidence of these things, but can't really be explained. All the church says is you can. You don't have to. But we do believe now that grandma would be beatified. She's a blessed. Wonderful. Now we maybe have a particular feast day for grandma. Maybe it was the date of her death. Maybe it was the date she became a mother for the first time. Maybe it was, I don't know, the day of her confirmation or baptism, whatever, right? There, in other words, it's a date that's chosen based on significance for the person, the saint. Okay, so we can start having a mass said for her. We can start adding her to the breviary that is prayed every day. But it's not universal. So what that means is, okay, it's not automatically done that every diocese will celebrate her. Not every diocese even can celebrate her. What that requires is other dioceses to contact the diocese that started the cause to actually do that. So, for instance, coming up here in about a month, well over a month, we have a beatification mass here in St. Louis for Venerable Fulton Sheen, who will then become Blessed Fulton Sheen. Now, just because it happens here in St. Louis doesn't mean every September 24th from here on out, we will celebrate that day as a memorial for Fulton Sheen. We have to petition the Diocese of Peoria that started the cause where Fulton Sheen was from. Maybe it was New York. I can't remember. There was a big debate back a few years ago between New York and Peoria, especially when they exhumed his body to start taking relics when he became venerable, of where he's going back to. Peoria won. But I think New York might have started the cause, so I'm not totally sure. But either way, whoever started the cause, we as St. Louis Archdiocese, we have to petition one of those archdioceses, to actually celebrate him in the archdiocese, diocese-wide.
There's always a reason for stuff. Mm-hmm. Please explain the reason behind that.
Because again, blesseds are not universally recognized on calendars, right? Some blesseds are just more regional devotions, right? So part of this is, and after one becomes venerable, is development of a cult. Now, let's be clear what we mean by that, right?
Not the bad.
All cult means is devotion, right? It's a gathering of people that have a devotion towards that particular saint, right? And so the question is, okay, how large is this cult? Where is it? Is it localized? Is it spread? The point is to spread it out. But the responsibility of actually promoting that is still the diocese that started the cause.
No, I can understand.
Right?
Yeah.
So
it's their vehicle.
Exactly.
They want to drive it.
Right.
And make sure it's maintained properly.
Right. And I mean, there really is no reason that a diocese may not want that to happen, because if they're trying to start the cause, they would, but also there could be good reasons. I mean, who knows? I mean, could there be bad actors who are trying to maybe bastardize the process, or, maybe who don't necessarily believe that the person's blessed and maybe want to desecrate it? I don't know.
Right.
I don't know if there's been an instance of the church where that has happened. I'd have to research that more. But yeah, the purpose though is that the cause, the diocese started the cause. They have the responsibility for spreading that devotion. And so petitioning the particular bishop where that cause started is kind of showing this deference, but also this unity of the church. That that even in the past, there wasn't this process that Rome would go through. There were a lot more regional processes that established. It was still similar. There was miracles attributed to the person, devotions, cults, that kind of thing that started, but it was much more regional. And so in this way, it's kind of recognizing the past tradition of the regional aspects of this canonization process. So that's kind of the purpose of it. Okay, so now she's blessed. Her cult, her devotion spreading all throughout the world in certain parts of the country or regions, whatever. Okay. Let's say there's another instance where, let's say, I don't know, my sister is in a bad car accident. She's not expected to live. Had some brain damage. She's in a coma. I start asking Grandma's intercession. Blessed Grandma, can you please allow your granddaughter, my sister, to live, right? And all of a sudden, lo and behold, she comes out of her coma. She's perfectly fine. There's no problem with her. Not even really a scratch, right? All this, even the scars have healed. There's no explanation for this. The medical science, again, cannot explain it. Again, Rome comes in and investigates, does all this, research, all these testings, interviews with the doctors, all that stuff. And they determine, yep, this is a miracle that is worthy of veneration and belief. Again, Don't have to believe it. You can believe it. There's good reasons to believe it, but we've determined this is a miracle. The Holy Father gets it again, says, "Yep, you know what? We believe that's true. Okay, we're now going to canonize her," which always happens in Rome. Well, I shouldn't say always. Pope Francis tend to canonize saints in other places, like for instance, Junipero Serra was actually canonized out in Los Angeles. The Holy Father came to visit and did the Mass there. Traditionally, it's always been done in Rome, but okay, fine. The Holy Father can do kind of whatever he wants in that regard. And so Grandma now becomes Saint Grandma. She's on the universal calendar, and she's celebrated. Now, how is she celebrated? That is determined by the local bishops, right? So some bishops may, even though recognize her as a universal saint, may not put her on the calendar in their particular diocese for whatever reason. Maybe there's not big enough devotion. Maybe there's other saints on the calendar that there is a bigger devotion, right? Yeah. Who knows? But at least on the universal calendar of the church that is headed by the Holy Father in Rome, she has a day on the calendar that is her feast day. And whether it be a memorial, an optional memorial, whether it be a feast day or solemnity, is determined by the Holy Father. He can elevate those, he can diminish those. So if the Holy Father makes her, let's say, a obligatory memorial, wow, it doesn't matter what the bishops say in their particular diocese. We're celebrating her on the calendar. The Holy Father can elevate her to a feast day for whatever reason. I mean, that's up to him. Again, a lot of this depends on how widespread the cult becomes, the devotion becomes, how much devotion people are giving to her. Maybe also personally what the Pope really decides, right? So, because part of the caveat of all this is the Holy Father can circumvent the entire process and canonize whoever he deems fit. So this doesn't happen it only happens very seldomly, very rarely that we see this occur. But the Holy Father has that right as the rock of the church, as the successor of Peter, as the successor of the apostles, to make that determination. He doesn't, I don't think, take that lightly. I think he has to have good reason for that. Maybe sometimes of his own witness. For instance, John Paul II canonized two saints that really were from Poland at the time, were contemporaries of him growing up. Maximilian Kolbe, who died in a concentration camp in Auschwitz. His feast day is actually this month too. It's on August 14th. And Sister Faustina Kowalska, who was a mystic nun who had visions of Jesus, which where the Divine Mercy Chaplet came from. These were all contemporaries of John Paul II, especially in his youth. And he canonized them, right? Good, fine, whatever. Now, to be fair, they were always already had a call started. They were kind of already on the process of that. So it probably wasn't that big of a jump. But the Holy Father can say, hey, that John Duffy guy is a great guy. I believe he's a saint. Done, he's a saint, right? He can do that, right? So that's kind of how that would work as far as how we celebrate them, where they would fall liturgically on the calendar. That's up to the Holy Father, but then also up to the local bishops. Once they become a saint, they're a saint, right? Now, one would say, well, wait a minute, we have tens of thousands of saints. Right? I heard you say that earlier, Father. How come we don't celebrate them all? Or this is just the New Testament saints? Well, no. As a matter of fact, we believe that even the Old Testament figures are canonized saints in the Catholic Church and have their own feast days, right? So Abraham, Moses, Isaiah, Jeremiah. And the reason we believe this is because of what happened on Holy Saturday, that Jesus went to Sheol, the underworld, and freed the faithful souls that were there because they couldn't get into heaven yet. Some saints we know for sure are in heaven because we look at people like Elijah, right? Or Moses. I guess Moses was already there, but that's a good tradition about that too. So we do recognize these Old Testament figures as canonized saints that have their own feast days, have their own celebrations, but maybe aren't necessarily on the calendar. So maybe a good example of that is St. Valentine. Now, St. Valentine has a feast day on February 14th. Now, In the new Mass, in the Novus Ordo calendar that we currently have today, that we celebrate in most places, we don't celebrate St. Valentine on February 14th. Does anyone know who we do celebrate in the Novus Ordo on November 14th? I'm sorry, February 14th.
I don't.
We actually celebrate two saints. They're brothers. Saint Cyril and Methodius. Who are they?
I
What's going on?
never
Right? Yeah,
gotten that.
exactly.
Actually, yeah,
Right.
we would have been here all night.
Right. So Saint Cyril and Methodius were the apostles to the Slavic people. That's right. So they're kind of 8th, 9th century saints that went to the Slavic area and actually evangelized and brought them into the faith. Right. So if you're of Slavic descent, Polish, Czechoslovakian, Hungarian,
And Catholic.
and well, even Christian for that matter, or even
Okay.
you can thank Cyril and Methodius for your conversion because they're the ones that brought the faith to those people. So one would say, well, what happened to St. Valentine? Is he not a saint? No, he is. But the problem that we found with St. Valentine is which St. Valentine? Because there was many legends, there was many saints that were established locally in these parishes. Remember, before we had this process, all these local areas were canonizing saints on their own. And so the question is which one? Because there also were some Valentines who were bishops that weren't really that great either. And we're not really talking about them. Okay, fine. But there were multiple St. Valentines around the same time because Valentine was a rather common name. Many of them converted to the faith, became bishops, also were martyred. So which one are we talking about? Okay. So because of the ambiguity, he was taken off the calendar. Now, doesn't mean he's not a saint. He's still a saint. It's just that because of this ambiguity, we don't really celebrate him anymore. Another example of that would have been St. Christopher. So we have St. Christopher medals, right? We still have these sacramentals that we venerate and hold. Again, the question is which St. Christopher, but also there's a lot of legends surrounding many of these saints. So part of the process of becoming a saint is the hagiography, right? That's kind of this investigation process that happens, right? Well, before it was actually more centralized, it was done more locally. And over time, there were these more legend than truth that was established in these ways, right? And so the question is, okay, what is true and what isn't? Because if it's a legend, well, there may be some basis in truth of that, but not necessarily supernatural. Like for St. Christopher, it was a legend that he actually Christ appeared to him as an infant and asked him to help him because he was a large man, a bigger guy, to cross the river. And so he carried the infant Jesus across the river. Now, the truth may be, well, he was actually a ferryman and his job was to ferry people across the river. So maybe, you can see how there was like this part of like, okay, well, there's some aspect of his life that's true that kind of got embellished to become something different. And if you can say, well, the face of Christ is in every human being. And so in that regard, he was ferrying these Christ presence across the river. Okay, but maybe not the actual infant Jesus, right? So there's many examples of that throughout history. Again, it doesn't take away the fact they're canonized. They're still saints. They still deserve veneration. They still deserve honor, but they're maybe not on the calendar because there's some ambiguous aspects of their life that we can't necessarily verify. And so we want to be sure, want to be true in the way we celebrate these things. So that's kind of the purpose of the canonization. That's kind of who saints are. That's why we venerate them. That's why we have them. Another aspect of this too is becoming a doctor of the church. So kind of the epitome, one would say, is becoming a doctor. Now, we want to be very clear that if you're with God in heaven, you don't necessarily care about all this, right? Because if you're God in heaven, you have your reward. You really don't care if you're canonized or have a feast day or whatever. You're still part of the church. You're still there with God. You're still even there at the Mass whenever we celebrate it. So in reality, if you're there, you wouldn't care. We do this not because of them. We do it for us, right? That these men and women are wonderful examples for us of how to live our life in accord with God's will and exhibit heroic virtue ourselves so we can also be there one day too. But some in particular, specifically only 39 of them, in their writings and their teachings were so profound that they were able to develop Catholic doctrine in a way that wasn't there before. And to be fair about that too, it's not that we come up with things that are new. We do apply them in certain aspects of life as we grow as a people, right? So they're all founded in the apostolic tradition, all founded in Scripture, in the magisterium, the tradition of the church, but they're maybe applied in a way that's relatively new. And so there are particular men and women who have exhibited that kind of like knowledge and wisdom to help the church understand better Christ's presence in our lives. And to be a doctor is actually even more scrutinizing process because every writing of that person needs to be in line with church teaching and even develop it a little bit further, right? So what that may look like? Well, let's say I keep a diary, right? And I pass away and there's a cause and I become a saint, whatever. Praise God, who knows? But my diary is not only in line with church teaching, but maybe I develop certain aspects, let's say, of a particular aspect of theology, let's say the death of Mary, right? Whether Mary died or not is a relatively open question when it comes to the theology of the church, that one can hold really any of these positions and still call themselves Catholic, call themselves Christian. But let's say I have such a great rationale and maybe even evidence through my own particular, let's say, personal revelation or even like maybe archaeological evidence to show that Mary didn't die. Well, I may write this in my journal and the church would scrutinize that and debate it and say, you know what, this was really interesting information that was never really there before. These are interesting insights. We believe that Father Madden, Mark Madden, would be a doctor of the church.
He has looked at this in a new way, in an outer way that we've never, in a new perspective that we've never
really thought about. And again, it's not.
Brought this to a new level.
It doesn't mean the church is saying that what I'm saying is the teaching of the church. It says this is an aspect that maybe never brought about, but it helps us develop further this truth, right? And that also can be relatively subjective, meaning it can also be like more timely. So, like for instance, Saint Augustine. Saint Augustine in his writings had a belief, it appears, that a child is not conceived until maybe 3 months after the actual marital act, right? And the reason is because, well, the only evidence they have of actually a baby being there was growth of the mother, right? When a mother starts to show, that indicates there's a child. So this is before, this is the 4th century. This is before there was actually understanding of sperm and ovum and all these kind of aspects of the woman's cycle and how this all works. So the only evidence they had was a woman showing. That means she's pregnant. That means there's a soul there, right? So in his writings, it was rather unscientific and wasn't true. But based on what he knew and what everyone else knew, it made sense, right? As we grow as a people and understand more and more, we have more knowledge, more understanding of God's presence, how he works in our lives. And so we can say, well, okay, yeah, even though he wasn't right about that, for the time he lived and for what they knew, it did make sense. And plus, he wasn't really trying to make that argument anyway. That was a tangent argument that he was trying to promote actually the good of marriage and procreation as a good. So that's in line with church teaching, even though it's not necessarily totally 100% factual, but based on the information and the time, it makes sense. So, okay, yeah, we can say that he's truly a doctor of the church because it was a thought. His thoughts were so wise and influential that they helped develop doctrine further. So that is, again, a long process. There's only 39 of them in the church today over the last 2,000 years, which goes to show how hard it is to become a doctor of the church, right? As a matter of fact, we actually celebrate a lot of them over the summer, which is kind of interesting too. So all that to say is that the process is there to actually verify and confirm, not necessarily to lead astray, which is why the church is so, some would even say OCD about these things. And even presenting contrary arguments. There's actually, with every cause, there's actually one called the Devil's Advocate that advocates against the canonization of the saint because they want to make sure it's true. So the saints are good. There's the community of saints that have been established, that have been revealed by Christ. They are intercessors on our part and examples for us to live. And so the process to actually now canonize saint is important because it actually the church wants it to be true. And so even though the church does canonize saints, it still is also respectful of the conscience and the rationale of human beings to not have to believe it. You have to believe there's a community of saints. You have to believe that. We believe in the church triumphant. But individuals, there can be questions. And sometimes the devil's advocate is kind of influential in that. There's a big question sometimes about Paul VI, St. Paul VI. The church canonized him. But one of the main arguments against him is that when he was establishing these new things, did he do it effectively enough to actually bolster and promote what the fathers of Vatican II actually wanted? And even his own writings, when it came to things like Humanae Vitae, did he really promote it in a way that actually was established as church teaching? Because there was a lot of questions after that came out, even today, of whether it's actually dogmatic or not. And that's kind of a problem, right? But that was brought up as sort of a counter against him to be a saint because, yeah, he didn't really exhibit that heroic virtue of maybe fortitude or perseverance to really get the word out about these things. But he's a saint. He's on the calendar. He's canonized. But there can be questions, right? So again, it's not about the doubt. Doubt should be avoided. Question can be an open thing. But the other thing to recognize too is the church is not going to uncanonize somebody. Once they're there, they're there. And so whatever reason you may have to not believe they're a saint, you maybe don't even want to celebrate them, that's okay. They're still saints by the church. And we should maybe have some deference towards that because the church is wiser than we are. And we always want to recognize that too. Good. Questions, comments, concerns, heresies?
One thing I was thinking is doctors of the church, there's a whole different meaning of those doctors. They were ones who dealt with the doctrine of the church.
Okay, good. Yeah, same root. So what doctor, the word doctor in Latin, what that means is teacher, right? So these aren't like, I have a bad arm, I need to go to the doctor, right? But even the doctors who go for like medical treatment, the aspect of the reason they're doctors is because they're actually allowed to teach.
They study and
right? They study, not practice, but teach it,
yeah.
Right? A doctor is someone that teaches somebody, which is, why doctors usually have interns and other people in the, growing up in the medical rank to teach them how to do that, right? Here's how you set an arm. Here's how you actually do a heart transplant. That's what doctors do. And so doctors of the church are those that help the teaching grow forward, right? So yeah, they're teachers. That's what the doctors are, right? So yeah, that's why they have the same root as doctrine, because doctrine is teaching. Doctor is a teacher. These are all Latin roots. That's why we need to learn our Latin, right? That's good. Yeah, that's right. But yeah, that's right, Joe. Good.
I was thinking that because they were so close together that
Exactly right. Exactly right. That's right. Good. Well, we have some people online too. So if there are any questions online, please feel free to write in the chat if you like. The meeting room is still open, but I don't think there's anybody there, so I can close that up. But yeah, if you have a question, please go ahead and put it in the chat if you're online. Otherwise, unless there's any questions here or any more commentary. So give everyone online a few more minutes or seconds to. Still got 4 viewing right now. Wow, might be a record. How about that? All right. I also got 1 thumbs up. Appreciate that. All right. Well, in that case, thank you for joining us. We'll see you next week for Bother the Father, hopefully. So then that's an open forum. If there are any kind of questions or lingering about the faith, about your personal life, things going on in the parish, whatever, that's an opportunity to kind of bring it, ask the question. Hopefully I'll have an answer. And if I don't, I will go find out. So have a good night, everybody. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next week, hopefully. God bless.